Good evening. This evening I would like to talk to you about the two main issues. First, I'd like to talk about school discipline. We're going to talk about school discipline and some of the reasons behind school discipline and the way school discipline should work out for an administrator or a teacher in those environments. The next thing we're going to talk about is equal access and equal opportunity for education. So we're going to talk about those two topics, and underneath those two topics, we're also going to briefly discuss some of the best practices where that's concerned. Now, in the issue of school discipline, in the first place, the reason for school discipline and the reason we want to be able to discipline students and have to discipline students is because we have to create a safe learning environment for our students. That is the key responsibility. I would say it's the primary responsibility of all school officials is to make a safe learning environment for students available. Now, this comes right out of No Child Left Behind Act. The No Child Left Behind Act states that schools which are persistently dangerous, if you have a student who gets injured in school or becomes a crime victim in school, the school district is supposed to place them in a safe school within the district. And that's a provision. And states are supposed to rate which schools are persistently dangerous. So that's an important note. Now, one of the Supreme Court cases, one of the recent court cases, well, I guess it wasn't a Supreme Court, it was a higher court case, was Kowalski versus Berkeley County Schools. This happened in West Virginia. I think this was a Fourth Circuit case. And it's basically an online bullying case. There was a couple of female students created a website on MySpace. It was called SASH, S-A-S-H. That acronym stood for Students Against Sluts Herpes, and it was primarily created to bully a student. Because of this, it ended up going all the way to court. And as a result of going to court, the court decided, based on the Tinker decision of the Supreme Court in 1969, said that free speech, free expression should be allowed as long as it doesn't disrupt the learning environment. And in this case, with these students doing this online bullying, that disrupted the learning environment. Okay, so again, the main issue for school safety is, or student discipline is it's the responsibility of school officials to ensure that there is a safe learning environment for our students. Bullying, of course, is just one of the issues. Classroom behavior becomes another issue because classroom behavior can influence the way other students are able to learn. It can hinder or inhibit their learning practices. There's also I think the directive that we have as educators to prevent school violence and to maintain peace and order, which in turn then maintains a healthy learning environment. We talk about best practices in student discipline. The National Association of School Psychologists says that we should be proactive and use positive reinforcement and positive education in order to prevent school violence. I mean, rather than discipline always with this negative and these negative connotations, the National Association of School Psychologists suggests that we do a number of things. Best practices would be things like violence prevention curriculum. One of the things that I'm familiar with as far as a violence prevention curriculum is a book. The book was known as Have You Filled a Bucket Today? And I was substitute teaching in a kindergarten classroom a couple of years ago in Kalamazoo Public Schools. And the regular teacher suggested that I read this book, Have You Filled a Bucket Today? It's a guide for daily happiness for kids. So I read that book to the kids in the morning, and the book describes something like if you fill a bucket, if you're kind to somebody, if you're nice to somebody, and if you're mean to somebody, you're actually taking out of their bucket, and you're taking out of your own bucket. And also, conversely, when you're filling, you're also filling your bucket when you fill somebody else's bucket, because everybody carries an invisible bucket. That's the nutshell of the book. But it provides for positive behavioral support. And the rest of the day in that kindergarten class when I was teaching, those kids were like, "Can I give you a hug? I want to fill your bucket. I need my bucket filled." And they were just so sweet and so adorable. It was really a lot of fun. Early intervention is another thing that we have to be mindful of when we talk about student discipline. When we talk about student discipline, we talk about early intervention. It's important to remember that this can mean just pulling aside a student and talking to a student. Just within the last couple of days on the CBS Evening News, there was a story from a school, and I can't remember where the school is, but the school custodian had been at the school for like 20 years, and as a school custodian at this school, this custodian routinely pulled students aside and talked to them. He'd been there for 30 years. This man he was concerned about the kids. Those are the kinds of things that when we talk about student discipline that we need to see happen. Now, of course, I would suggest that this is a broader social issue. There's family issues, there's neighborhood issues, poverty issues, very, very big issues when we're talking about the issue of student discipline. But we can make great inroads as educators by just reaching out to these students and treating them the way they ought to be treated. I like to think as in ethics, and when I talk about ethics, which I do quite often, I like to think of it. Immanuel Kant suggests in his second formulation of the categorical imperative that we always treat people as ends rather than as means. What this idea entails is rather than treating them as something we can pursue or we can go after, some means to an end, we are to treat them as if they are an end in themselves, which means that we are to treat them as if they are human beings, valued human beings. Now this, I understand, is not always an easy task to do when you're in a classroom and frustrations happen, but the idea is that we need to foster in our young people the opportunity, the ability, and the conditions, create the conditions where these students can succeed. And that, I think, is the most important part. Now, I briefly want to talk about equal education opportunities. When we talk about equal education opportunities, we're always going to talk, when discussing equal opportunity to education law, we're going to discuss Brown versus the Board of Education. In the Brown versus the Board of Education, this was in the 1954 decision, Chief Justice Warren wrote that we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. So, in the South, civil rights era, pre-civil rights era, we have doctrines and Jim Crow laws that basically said we're going to create education opportunities for African Americans, but we're going to create them so they are separate but equal. And what the Warren Court decided was that equality in practical means just really did not exist. So that is certainly an issue. Now, when we talk about education law, we also want to talk about, and the idea of equal access to education. Certainly, that is something that Brown versus Education gives us. However, we have another problem, and this is part of the larger social problem and bigger social issues, family issues, poverty issues, community issues. But in many states, we have what is known as de facto segregation. And this is where, excuse me, where we have communities, because of poverty, because African Americans are more represented in these poor communities, or whatever the reason, deep-seated prejudice, whatever causes these large, poor African or poor, disadvantaged African American communities, the conditions that cause those lead to something that's known as de facto segregation. Now, de facto segregation, many states have laws that try and forbid this and try to overcome it, but there is no universal legal way, it seems, or at least nationwide standard for ending these de facto segregation problems, which are actually caused by, to a large degree, just caused by larger social issues that may be out of the educators' hands. But whatever we can do in the field of education, as education administrators, whatever we can do to mitigate those problems, I think it's a good idea that we do so. My last idea here, when I want to talk about, as I talk about best practices for equal educational opportunities, many of the recent discussions about the needs of children in the educational environment, many of these discussions that we have led to a conclusion that yes, students have different needs. And what we have to do as educators is create not only an inclusive educational style, but we also have to create an inclusive educational environment. An environment that takes students and puts them in a place where they are able to get the learning, get the education they need in the best way possible. So I think that's what we need to do. We need to create inclusive environments. We need to make certain that what we do and when we do the things that we do, that we're making an environment for students to learn. And that's really the key. If our educational environment, whether it be because of student discipline or because of equal education opportunities, if it's not conducive to student learning, it is going to harm not just the students that we're trying to reach with behavioral problems, or the students that we're trying to reach because we're trying to reach students of disadvantaged families, poor disadvantaged families, or whatever, based on race or socioeconomic issues or whatever. We want to make sure that we can reach them. And if we can do that, we will succeed in changing America and changing the world. I thank you very much for joining me tonight. I hope you have a great night. We'll talk to you later.